Okay, Sarah, now I think we're ready to start for the next part of our program.
I think so too, Laarni. So now let us move on to the plenary session and the keynote presentation.
To serve as the chair for our sessions this morning is Dr. Emmanuel De Dios. Dr. De Dios is a professor and former dean of the University of the Philippines, Diliman School of Economics. He has written articles on institutions and economic development, political economy, history of economic thought, international economics, and the theory of individual choice. Let us all welcome Dr. De Dios.
Thank you, Laarni and Sarah. I'm very happy to be here. The theme of our first session this morning is the design and regulation of electricity markets, international perspectives. Our keynote speaker is Professor Frank Wolak. Professor Wolak is professor in the Department of Economics at Stanford University. He's also visiting scholar at the University of California Energy Institute and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He currently directs the program on energy and sustainable development in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Professor Wolak served as chairman of the Market Surveillance Committee of the California Independent System Operator for Electricity Supply in California from 1998 to 2011. And he was a consultant to the California and U.S. Departments of Justice on market power issues in the telecommunications, electricity, and natural gas markets. Professor Wolak was also involved in various USAID projects that include assisting the Energy Regulatory Commission in the Philippines on the restructuring of the Philippine electricity supply industry. His fields of specialization are industrial organization, energy, environmental economics, and econometric theory. His recent work evaluates methods for introducing competition into infrastructure industries like telecommunications, electricity, water delivery, and postal delivery services, and assesses the impact of these competition policies on consumer and producer welfare. He received his PhD in economics and MS in applied mathematics from Harvard, and his undergraduate degree came from Rice University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Frank Wolak, with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the long introduction. I'm sure you can read the bios in the conference manual, but thank you anyway. So I would definitely like to thank the presenters for the invitation to present today. What I'm going to talk about is international experience with electricity design and market monitoring. What I thought I'd start out with is a discussion of what we mean by market design, talk about the two major challenges, the first being what we'll call productive efficiency. That's the challenge of the former regime that restructuring is designed to address. The other one that it arises in the restructured regime is what we'll call market power. And so first what I'd like to talk about is the evidence on the first one, in the sense that I think that, as you'll see, I think the international evidence is pretty good that we've at least addressed the first issue with respect to restructuring, which is improving the productive efficiency of industry. Where the outstanding challenge is this what we'll call ability and incentive to exercise market power, meaning the rate at which the cost reductions that we see are translated into market price reductions. And we'll talk about some of the ways that at least that can be addressed. And then finally, give a short sort of discussion of things that could be some of the applications I think may be relevant to the Philippines experience. So what we mean by the market design process, and the big issue here, is the fact that what will happen is once we put a market in place, the market participants are going to effectively act in their own best interest, and we need to take that into account into the design of the market. The other thing about market design is that there are many feasible designs, The challenge is really to find the one that works best for your context. And so what this really means is that market design is really a process of continuous improvement. All the markets around the world, the ones that probably perform the best are the ones where that process is built in right from the start. It's very unlikely that you're going to get it exactly right out of the box. So that, as we said, the big issue in the case of with price regulated, with the former regime, is what we'll call productive efficiency, meaning how do I essentially get least cost production, the most output for the given amount of inputs. And here the issue is really the challenge of regulation is this problem of I don't know as much as the firm does about me as the regulator, and this creates this regulatory slack which gives the firm opportunities for perhaps inefficient production that may benefit their shareholders, may benefit the management of the firm. One of the goals of restructuring is to try to squeeze those productive inefficiencies out. The major challenge in the new regime of restructuring is this idea that we know that firms, privately owned firms, shareholder firms, they have very little incentive to pass on cost reductions into the prices that they charge, and that in the language of economics says that markets susceptible to the exercise of unilateral market power. And if you wrote down all the characteristics as an economist that you would think makes markets very susceptible to the exercise of unilateral market power, i.e. the unilateral ability of a firm to raise price by its own actions, electricity pretty much has all those characteristics. Those are listed here. Things like, for example, electricity delivered through a specialized network, non-storability, capacity constraints in production. All of these things make it very easy for firms in the electricity supply industry to exercise a substantial amount of market power in a very short period of time. This has been learned over and over again in restructured markets around the world. So this is something that must be addressed by any market design. So what's the international evidence that these market mechanisms have in fact improved productive efficiency? Well, these come from 4 places. First is essentially reducing, I'll give you 4 examples from the literature. The first is from a paper cited here that essentially finds that for what are called non-fuel costs for U.S. utilities, utilities in restructured markets tended to have lower costs than those that did in the non-restructured markets, meaning the regions of the United States that maintain vertical integration had higher costs than those where they'd actually introduced these market mechanisms. Another study looked at the question of the operating behavior of power plants. This study said, well, what about if we compare similar power plants in regions with formal markets to those in regions without formal markets? And what they found was roughly about a 2% improvement in the heat rate, meaning that you're using less BTUs to produce a given kilowatt hour in the restructured market than you are in the unrestructured market. Another source of benefits is expanding the geographic scope of the formal market mechanism. And so for those of you familiar with the Philippine market, the idea is what I'm going to do in this context and what these authors studied is the expansion of this market in the eastern United States, the PJM market. It at first included just the red area, the green area, and the yellow area, and it expanded to all the areas west of that. And so what this did was gave the system operator, the independent system operator, visibility on that entire grid. The other thing about it is the blue area there, for those of you who know a little about US geography, is also an area with very rich and low-cost coal. And so the idea is that this could potentially allow more of that low-cost coal to get into the eastern market where all of the people live and therefore sell more power into that region. And that's precisely what happened. And here, the graph that I show you right here is essentially the bottom line is showing you this is what, and the vertical line is showing commensurate with the date that the market expanded, meaning that the formal market expanded to include the blue area there and the lighter blue area. the amount of flow that came from that area into the Eastern market increased instantaneously. We had a roughly about, as I said right here, an increased gains from trade as a result of this market integration of on the order of $160 to $180 million a year. So in a formal wholesale market significantly, if you like, reduced the cost of serving electricity demand in all of the areas, the colored areas in this picture right here as a result of that integration. The last bit is something that's worth just briefly introduce is the introduction of what's called multi-settlement markets. All the US markets have run what's called a multi-settlement market, which means there's a day-ahead forward market where firm financial commitments are sold, as well as a real-time imbalance market where market participants trade essentially deviations relative to their day-ahead schedule. So the important point to remember is that I, as a supplier or as a demander, what I sell in the day ahead is a firm financial commitment in the sense that I get paid for that. Now, if it turns out, as the example I showed, is that if I say sold 40 in the day ahead market at $25, I get $4,000. But if I only produce 30 from my unit in real time, I've got to buy out that 10 megawatts that I didn't supply in the real-time market at whatever the real-time price is. And the same goes for load-serving entities. They basically buy something day ahead, and if they consume more, they got to buy that in the real-time market, or equivalently, if they don't consume it, they can sell it in the real-time market. And that's a significant benefit of the multi-settlement market mechanism, is it allows consumers to participate actively in the wholesale market. Why? Because if I'm a consumer, and as the example I give, suppose I buy 100 megawatts in the day-ahead market at a price of 30, and I see that the price in real time is going to be 80, I just consume less and effectively sell, in my example, sell the 10 megawatts that I don't consume in the real-time market at $80, and I pocket a profit of effectively the difference between the real-time price and the day-ahead price times the amount that I didn't consume. And what this does is facilitates the participation of demand response in these markets because you don't have to come up with these administratively set baselines to determine what a demand response was, i.e. you don't have to say, okay, I'm going to set this level relative to which you reduce your output. Uh-oh, not good. Ooh. Well, I think we're stuck here. Okay. Well, oh, here we go. All right. So, okay. So, what we want to talk about here is the fact of how this multi-settlement can interact with the performance of the short-term market. One of the big lessons from electricity market design around the world is the fact that as I write right here, is that the energy market that you set up to pay people for what they do has to, as close as possible, mirror the physical realities of the operation of the grid. And in a number of markets around the world where this hasn't been done, say for example, a market where you run it as a single zone and you set a price over a large geographic region, the implicit assumption is that there is infinite transmission capacity between all locations. This creates an incentive for firms to essentially take advantage of the difference between the financial market configuration and the physical reality of the grid. And in those cases, this can lead to significant market inefficiencies. And the advantage of a locational pricing market is the fact that which exists in the Philippines, is the fact that you are pricing all relevant constraints that are used to operate the grid. And one of the things, just to examine that, the combination of the multi-settlement system, meaning a day-ahead market and real-time market, combined with locational marginal pricing, significantly reduces the incentives that people have to take it. Oh man, sorry, the thing is messing up. Okay, so what we find in the case of California is switching from a zonal market design where these activities were possible to a nodal market design improved the efficiency of the market by roughly 2%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but averaged over the entire, or summed over the entire year, it's roughly about $105 million annual savings associated with that. The other is the side of it is, as well as the LMP, locational marginal pricing market, combined with multi-settlement, is the fact that this allows financial transactions, or what is called in the United States virtual bidding. And what this means is essentially traders or market participants can essentially take advantage of potential differences between the day ahead and real-time price. So for example, what I might want to do if I think, say, that the day ahead price, as I wrote right here, is going to be less than the real-time price, what I would want to do is purchase power in the day ahead market and sell it in real time. That is an example of what's called a decremental bid. And what this does is I simply earn this difference between the day ahead and real-time price, or the difference between real-time and day ahead price, depending upon what I think is the case. But the advantage of this is the fact that this can significantly reduce the cost of dispatching the system. Why? Well, it's because the virtual bidder profits from the fact that they anticipate what the configuration of the grid is going to look like in real time, and if they're correct, they're rewarded. If they're incorrect, they are basically punished in the sense that they lose money. And so what this does is essentially, the simplest way to describe it is that it harnesses the desire of these traders to make money exploiting these price differences, but the act of exploiting these price differences makes, if you like, the deviation between day ahead and real-time schedules as small as possible, as well as provides an incentive for the grid to be, for the least cost configuration in real time to be found by the market. And one of the things we looked at is the introduction of this in the California market, and found that again, roughly the introduction of this had a significant improvement both in the efficiency of the dispatch as well as the cost of the dispatch. So the introduction of this purely financial player in a multi-settlement market with locational marginal pricing had a sizable annual benefit, as you see right here. So it looks pretty good in terms of, as I said, the production cost savings from introducing these market mechanisms. The evidence is quite good internationally. The evidence is probably less good in terms of translating production cost reductions into retail price reductions. There's a variety of reasons for that, but probably the most important is this market power problem. And the simplest way I like to think about it is to say unilateral market power in electricity is like gravity. It's basically, it's there. And why? Because every single hour of every single day, if I am a firm, my desire is to maximize the returns to my shareholders. That is equivalent to maximizing profits. That is equivalent to exercising all available unilateral market power. So what I have to do as the market designer is recognize and manage that. Just like an airplane manages gravity in terms of how it flies, as a market designer, you need to manage unilateral market power. So a big problem with that has to do with the fact of the configuration of the transmission grid. It was not, in most cases, built for this wholesale market regime. It wasn't built to be a facilitator of commerce. What we had is essentially, in the vertically integrated regime, the vertically integrated utility could essentially take advantage of the economies to scope between transmission and generation to serve load throughout the entire grid. In the wholesale market regime, we're separating transmission, so that's financially separate, from generation. And now what we do is create an incentive for generators to effectively take advantage of the configuration of the grid to create high prices where their generator is located and potentially low prices where their generators are not. And in that sense, that takes this form, is that in all markets around the world, no matter almost how much transmission capacity you have, there are system conditions when effectively you are a local monopolist as a generator. And what this has led to in all these markets is the need for what's called a local market power mitigation mechanism. And for markets to forget this, it's really at your own peril. All markets in the United States have local market power mitigation mechanisms, and markets that don't typically experience some pretty severe local price spikes as a result because of this situation that essentially one or two firms have tremendous ability to raise prices at a certain location. So just to give you an example, the simplest form of a local market power mitigation mechanism, or just market power mitigation in general, is offer caps, although those are essentially the poor man's market power mitigation and probably as much as possible should be avoided, particularly if you're running an energy-only market. The ones that at least make much more sense are what are called essentially automatic mitigation procedures. So the way that they work is as I've described right here, is first you have a set of system conditions where you say, okay, we deem this supplier as having such a large ability to move the price at its location that we have to mitigate it. We cannot let his bid set the price at his location. Then the next step is to say, okay, given that we've decided he has so much ability to raise prices, the next step we say we're going to mitigate his offer. And we decide what we mitigate his offer to, and typically that's going to be some measure of the supplier's cost that has been submitted to the regulator. And then the third step is what are we going to pay him when he's subject to mitigation? And typically it is going to be the market clearing price with the mitigated bid substituted for that supplier's actual bid. And in the US, there are two forms of these mitigation procedures. There are what are called the conduct and impact tests. Those are typically in the eastern markets, and in the California, in Texas, and PJM, they're what are called market structure based. And maybe in the question and answer get into more detail on that, but the basic point of this, of having this is the fact that there are circumstances when a certain supplier or a small number of suppliers or even one supplier has such an ability that there's virtually no limit that they can charge because they essentially face an inelastic demand for their output, typically because of the configuration of the transmission grid, outages of other units or something like that. And in those circumstances, there is a mitigation measure that prevents them from essentially taking advantage of that fact. Okay, so what about on the system-wide basis? How do I limit the ability of firms to exercise unilateral market power on a system-wide basis? That's the first and probably most important is an active forward market for energy. And this is probably the biggest lesson that I want to get across today is the fact that besides the hedging characteristic that a forward market provides, meaning the ability to sell your power in the forward market and therefore hedge the price risk that you might face as a supplier or a purchaser, the big thing that a forward market commitment does to you is that it essentially makes you a more aggressive competitor, i.e. makes you unilaterally want to submit an offer curve that is closer to your marginal cost of production into the short-term market. The simple intuition for that is that until I cover my forward position, meaning I've sold, say, 50 megawatts in the forward market, until I sell more than 50 megawatts from my generation unit in the short-term market, I'm a net seller, I'm a net buyer of electricity. Once I get past that, yes, I'm a net seller, but the other thing that it does is it shrinks the size of the market over which suppliers compete. By shrinking the size of that market, we get more competition. So the other problem with this is that because of the realities of how we price electricity, it's very hard to provide the appropriate signals for suppliers as well as for retailers to contract to the levels that they should, perhaps from an economic efficiency criteria, contract. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is the fact that you can't let the price of electricity go to the level necessary to clear the market under all states of nature. That's just not something that the political process is going to let happen. And so if I, as a retailer, I am the very virtuous retailer and I contract for my full amount, I know that I'm in some sense just being a nice guy and getting no benefit from it. Why? Because if a period when there is insufficient supply arises in the aggregate, period of insufficient supply in the aggregate arises, their technology neither exists nor the political will exists to only curtail the people that didn't contract enough. And instead, what happens is it's pro rata contracting, it's rolling blackouts, it's things like this. So essentially, I, as the retailer, know that I probably shouldn't, it doesn't make any sense for me to contract up to the level necessary to fully hedge my supply risk. And so we have what I like to call this kind of reliability externality, in that everybody's waiting for somebody else to essentially contract up to make sure that there's adequate supply, to make sure that there isn't this supply shortfall. So what happens in a number of markets around the world, particularly this is essentially, there is a regulatory fix. So the fact that we can't let markets work the way that we would typically like markets to work, i.e. let price rise to the level of the clear demand in all states of the world, that's politically impossible. In order to fix that, we need a regulatory fix. The usual regulatory fix is essentially mandating levels of contracting at various horizons to delivery. So for example, in virtually all Latin American markets, the regulator essentially says, look, you must purchase a certain quantity of your expected demand, retailer, in a forward fixed price forward contract at a horizon in advance of delivery. I just put up some examples here. These are purely examples. They're not taken from any market, but like say 100% of your expected demand 1 year in advance of delivery, 90% 2 years, 80% 1 year in advance. And what this does, as well as essentially ensuring that there is a very vibrant and competitive short-term market, where it also ensures that there's a revenue stream for new generation capacity to be built, because suppliers are out there purchasing these forward contracts that don't deliver for 2, 3, or up to 4 years in advance, which then allows that to occur. So the big advantage of this energy contracting solution is you're essentially letting the market decide what is the efficient generation mix. You're just simply saying to the market, buy the demand, retailers, that you know you need. Market supply side, you figure out the least cost way to do that. We don't put any requirements on what the reserve margin is or anything like that. We're going to let the supply side of the market figure that out. And then the final thing that I put in red here is important, which is why it is in red, is that essentially it's important to bear in mind that all of the markets around the world trade virtually zero in the day-ahead and real-time markets. That in other words, virtually everything is covered by a fixed price forward contract, and you don't do that at your peril. Basically, all wholesale market meltdowns around the world, California, New Zealand, Colombia, the United Kingdom in the early days of the pool, were all the result of essentially over-reliance on the short-term market. Why? Because as you open up the size of that market, you increase the likelihood that one firm is going to essentially be necessary to serve the market, or know that they're necessary to serve that market, and therefore have a unilateral incentive and ability to raise the price substantially. And the key then to a very competitive wholesale market is this, as I said, a very active and vibrant forward market for energy. So how do you get that? Well, one way that's been used in a number of contexts in Colombia, this has been introduced in Singapore, they just recently introduced this, is essentially a standardized forward market for energy. And what happens is that you have like futures contracts that might trade, in the case of the Philippines, against the load-weighted average price in the system for each hour. And then the idea is retailers are required to purchase these contracts at various horizons of delivery. The other thing that this does is that it provides a very transparent wholesale market price that can be used for the purpose of setting regulated retail prices. So in other words, rather than having to validate each retail contract that's signed, you just say, look, you as a retailer, you get this weighted average of these forward contract prices that come through this market. That is the pass-through that you get to charge on your retail price, and you've essentially eliminated the need to do significant reviews such as that. The other important advantage that the Singaporeans are certainly learning from this is the fact that it also increases the competitiveness of the retail market. Why? Because I, as a purely financial player, I don't even own generation, I can come in, I can buy a forward contract. With that forward contract, I can now become a retailer. I can compete against the firms that own generation and sell retail power to consumers that I've hedged with this standardized product, and therefore provide further downward pressure on retail prices as a result of that activity. So the next step of enhancing the competitive short-term market is essentially transmission expansions. So the important thing about transmission expansions from our perspective in the wholesale market regime is, I like to think of it like this, is in the old regime, essentially a transmission expansion, if you like, improve the performance of an imperfectly regulated utility. In the wholesale market regime, a transmission expansion improves the performance of an imperfectly competitive market. Why? Because essentially it increases the amount of competitors that can compete against any location in the grid. In other words, if you have a lot of transmission capacity, I, as a firm, know that more power can get in to compete against me, and so therefore I know that I have to be a bit more of an aggressive competitor. And in some work that I've done with the Alberta system operator, essentially we try to quantify, well, how much more competitive is this market as a result of the fact that expanding the grid faces firms with greater competition. And what we find in this context is fairly substantial what are called competitiveness benefits. Just the fact that we upgraded the transmission makes the firms bid more aggressively because they know they face more competition, and therefore leads to lower wholesale prices because suppliers are able to exercise less unilateral market power. This is something that's getting in, this sort of competitiveness benefit is getting into more and more transmission planning processes to find locations that essentially give you that big bang per buck in terms of this, this benefit. So the next bit is, as well as what we'll call symmetric treatment of load and generation. And what we're, oh boy. Okay, sorry. Okay, skipped one. Back, skip. Okay, so the next step is the fact that what we want to do, particularly for customers with interval meters, is we want to treat those customers the same way that we treat generators. So if I'm a generator and I don't sign a forward contract with anybody, I sell my power in the short-term market. The same should apply to customers that essentially have interval meters, meaning we can read their consumption on a half-hourly basis. And that default price should be the real-time price. Why should it be the real-time price? It's because of the fact that if it is that real-time price, then we're providing them with the maximum incentive to be active participants in the wholesale market, to be the suppliers of what I've written here of negawatts, since as far as the grid's concerned, it likes negawatts as much as it likes megawatts, because all that matters is the supply and the demand balance in the grid. And so one way to think about doing this is not to say that you're going to require the person to purchase everything at that real-time price, but it's more like how you purchase, at least in the United States, cell phone service. So what you might do is you'd purchase, do I look as ridiculous as I feel? Okay, so, all right, so this is essentially an example of a load shape. So what I would do is I could purchase this red load shape in advance. And I gave you an example of how that might work. I buy a flat rate for 1.5 megawatts. I buy little peaks for 6 days a week for only those 16 hours. And then I buy super peak for about 5 days a week for roughly 4 hours. And I get that red line. That is locked in. That's like my, in the case of cell phone, that's like my monthly minutes that I purchased. Then what happens is, in real time, if my consumption's the blue line, if I'm above the red line, just like with the cell phone, I buy back at the penalty price. But in our case, if it's a multi-settlement market, I'm essentially buying power at the real-time price. And if I'm below that, it's like the cell phone plan, I have rollover minutes, but instead I can essentially sell that power back at the real-time price. And that does two things. It continually exposes the consumer to the real-time price at the margin, but it protects them from bill risk, and essentially it becomes essentially a very effective way for consumers to participate in the short-term market with the minimal amount of bill risk. And if consumers are adjusting their demand in response to the real-time price, producers necessarily are going to have to be more aggressive because they know consumers can go away if the price is too high. Okay, so the last issue is the role of the regulator. And here, the important point here is market rules. You have to have market rules that essentially are essentially strictly enforced without exception. And have a stakeholder, typically the way it works in the US markets, I think is a useful thing, is essentially have a stakeholder process where the rules are vetted, but ultimately it is the regulator that sets the rules, it is the regulator that enforces the rules, and there is no way that essentially they can get around that. And so the other bit about it is the regulator in the wholesale market regime really needs to be proactive, prospective. So for example, in the case of the transmission planning and expansion process, is that it needs to be forward-looking and saying, a good example would be in areas where you're interested in expanding renewables. Well, typically you know where the renewable resource is. You know where the solar resource is, you know where the wind resource is. If you have a renewable energy goal, you basically say, we know we're going to have to build transmission out to that region. You build it prospectively. Most of the US markets with significant renewable energy goals have, for example, both in California and in Texas, they have what are called competitive renewable energy zones. And what these are regions that the system operators have designated that there are significant renewable resources there, and so therefore transmission is built out to those regions in anticipation of fulfilling the mandate, such as the case in California of the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or in the case of Texas, the fact that a lot of wind resources that are very, very cost effective exist out in West Texas, so a lot of transmission was built out to that in order to facilitate its interconnection. So the other is just the other points about that is the regulator is really sort of the educator of market participants. He's the nudger, meaning that provides nudges to market participants to make sure particularly the smaller market participants are doing okay in the market. And then finally, the big role of a regulator is the provision of information and analyses of the performance of the market to the public as well as to market participants. And that's a very, very important role, just to both for the simple reason of reducing the barriers to entry, making it much easier for the public to understand how the market's working, why the market is doing what it's doing, in order for people to set appropriate expectations as well as a positive and negative for what the market can deliver. So in the last bit is just say what lessons might be useful for the Philippines. The first is, I think, the consideration of this multi-settlement market. I think this has, particularly given the Philippines, the fact that there are many combined cycle natural gas units, and those typically have some fairly sophisticated scheduling issues associated with them. Having a day-ahead forward market where you can submit your willingness to supply for all 24 hours in the day simultaneously, this model is solved for the dispatch for all 24 hours of the day in the day-ahead market. That has a tremendous, I think, efficiency potential there. The next is a local market power mitigation mechanism that recognizes and mitigates in advance of making essentially a determination of when the supplier is worthy of local market power mitigation, what the offer price they're able to submit when that's true, and what they get paid. The other is a transport forward market. As I said, the lesson from Singapore and the establishment of its futures market for electricity, I think, has a lot to recommend it. Similarly, for the case of Colombia. The other is this idea of the symmetric treatment for at least customers with interval meters, the forward-looking transmission planning process we discussed, and essentially the fact that a stakeholder-based but essentially regulator-led rules development process where essentially strict enforcement, uniform enforcement. So that's the basic story. And just to reiterate, at least the international evidence, certainly the cost of producing electricity under the wholesale market regime, there certainly appears to be very good evidence that that's been benefited by this restructuring process. The extent to which consumers have benefited, there's a variety of reasons why in the US I think that hasn't happened, but the fundamental one has been this market power problem, but there are the mechanisms that we discussed that have, I think, can really help to realize that, and there's evidence, at least, that's starting to potentially have some impact. And then finally, this multi-settlement and the other issues that I discussed. And so in the interest, I think in the interest of time, I'll stop here, and thank you.
So thank you very much. That was breakneck speed and certainly very enlightening. I'm sure you have questions. For Professor Wolak, a few ground rules. We'll take 2 questions at a time. And please limit your question to at most 2 minutes. Before you ask your question, please state your name and affiliation. So there are mics on the sides and at the center. So Jim.
Thanks, I'm Jim Romaset.
I'll do another one.
So Josco wrote, I guess in 2011, that the New York wholesale market prices were typically 1/3 above Chicago. And according to your map, they're on the same grid. So is that because of transmission constraints? They can't send enough from Chicago back to New York?
So did you say New York?
Yeah, New York.
Yeah, New York's not in the same ISO as Chicago. So that gets into seams issues. So that's as well can be congestion, but the PJM does not contain New York. New York is a separate ISO. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other reasons why the prices in New York are much higher. They have a much older fleet of units, but but it's not an interconnected market. So they simply, that's one reason. The other reason is definitely transmission congestion.
Yeah, so if you look at New England, maybe that would be a better example. So
excuse me?
Maybe New England is a better example.
New England is as well as a separate ISO.
Okay, so I don't know what to make of this recommendation by Josco that the first thing you might do is look at the wholesale market matrix, geographical matrix, maybe pick representative, peak times, off-peak times, and look at the differences. And is there something you can infer from that, or do you just have to run the whole model or something?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, to the extent that I think you can, one of the big issues in the U.S. markets is these so-called seams issues, where there are, like for example, in the eastern United States, there's the PJM market, there's the New York market, there's the New England ISO market. Each of those are run separately. There is some trading across the markets, but for the most part, the New England and New York are essentially don't have access to a lot of very cheap Appalachian coal, which is typically what may be setting prices in the PJM market. So that could in part explain price differences. But I think it's really, you probably don't want to look across markets because there's also often just legal regulatory reasons for price differences across the ISOs as well.
Okay.
I mean, within the ISOs, I think the argument that you're making makes a lot of sense to look at that. So typically in the case of PJM, you'll see much higher prices on the eastern coast of the United States than in the West Virginia region, and that's largely because of transmission congestion as well as losses from the Appalachian region to the East Coast where all the people live.
Anyone? Please, state your name, please.
Yeah, I'm Tony Moraza with Avoid This Power. You mentioned traders. I've read a lot about them in that in most countries they've been a problem in that their balance sheets are relatively small. And when the market goes against them, they're unable to effectively perform on the commitments that they've made. What's your experience, or how has this been controlled so that people don't eat mistakes that people can handle?
Typically, the so-called there's typically in the ISOs they have a fairly involved process for traders to participate. So, for example, in all the U.S. markets, if I'm a trader, I have to put up sort of trust money, and my trading is limited only to the amount of trust money that I put up. And so, I mean, a good example would be in all the U.S. markets, when Enron went bankrupt, Enron, I suspect everyone here knows, it wasn't even a blip. No one even noticed it. Largely because essentially there was these position limits in place, and everybody could just simply unwind the positions fairly easily. So it's not to say that you don't have to worry about the issue that you discussed, but both the commodities markets as well as the electricity markets have a lot of these safeguards built in place, and if anything, they're very sensitive to this issue, and they do have some pretty stringent financial requirements on the traders for participating, so that these sorts of circumstances typically, at least in the U.S., have not arisen. And I'm not aware of them. I mean, in some other contexts there have been, but the basic point is failure to pay attention to exactly the issue that you described, which is, letting a trader participate with no significant limit based on how much money he's put up into the the kitty, so to speak, at the ISO.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Miguel Aboitis Power. I have two related questions. One is, you mentioned that there's a price mitigation mechanism when somebody in one given area has too much pricing power. My question is, and I think that's a new concept to us, because only the pricing in that area is mitigated. You don't affect the pricing in the whole grid. Is that correct?
If there's congestion, yeah. So basically, I can, if I know there's only 50 megawatts that can get in to compete against me, if I let that 50 megawatts get in, then I basically face an inelastic demand for anything left over, and therefore can set my price as high as I want. That would be one such example. Typically, it's because of the configuration of the grid.
Okay. My second question is that how do you keep a peaking plant whole, where a peaking plant in that area? How do you keep them whole when they typically dispatched only 20% capacity factor, etc.? If you
you certainly. I mean, you're never going to say you can't. You have to run at a price below your cost. It's just typically a lot of times. So, for example, if the peaking plant is running because of the fact that it's a local scarcity constraint, they will get the local scarcity price. So think of it as under LMP, if there's many instances where the price at a location can be higher than the offer price that anyone has submitted because of the fact that the transmission congestion or other operating constraints make the marginal price higher than their offer price. So there is ample ability for these units to earn their revenues to stay in business. And the other is to the extent that they're running during system-wide conditions, there's typically no mitigation on them during those circumstances. So the two things that are important to bear in mind is when you're designing the mechanism is you want to make sure that the supplier can get the scarcity rents that are appropriate to the fact that they are at the location that they are and it's a scarce resource. But you can't name your price is the basic idea.
So you're saying that the mitigation is only during congestion constraints set by the system.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much there's a bit more to it than that, but the basic idea is if you are a simple way to describe it would be is if you are a firm facing an inelastic demand for your product because of your location in the grid, you're not going to be able to name your price at whatever you want to have it. Then that's basically what the local market power mitigation mechanism does. It essentially says, look, unless you face effective competition, we're not going to let price, you set the price. And then the first step in the mitigation measure is to decide what is effective competition. And then the next step is what would we then do in terms of what your offer would be. And no one ever contemplates that your offer is going to be less than your cost, your marginal cost of operating. There may be adders that you can put in or things like that, and then moreover, then typically you're allowed to earn the market clearing price at your location, which can reflect all the local operating constraints that exist there. So, but it's just, preventing, if you like, these extreme forms of local market power that effectively reduce what we want is and the purpose of these mechanisms is to get suppliers to focus on supplying power rather than playing games against the network.
Right, but what if it's inelastic but throughout the network?
Excuse me?
It's inelastic but throughout the network, meaning it's not a localized...
Oh, that's scarcity conditions, and you typically probably, that's not local market power. Right, so
right.
It's only if it's local system-wide. That's a separate issue. I mean, personally, my view is look, that's fair game. I mean, that's in some sense, if you're a peaker unit, that's when you should be making your money. And examples include from Australia, they have a 13,000 offer cap, and there are certain peaker units that they supply at that price and for just a few hours a year, and they make it up. And but then that's also the incentive for you as a retailer to hedge it. So then they also have a very active forward market where guys can purchase cap contracts that say, look, I want insurance against that price spike, and I'll pay you every month as the peaker unit to provide that insurance. So, and which is what we want to develop.
Okay, thank you. We can take 2 more questions, I think. Anyone?
Thank you.
I thought Romy was going to ask a question. Okay. Going? Going? Well, thank you very much, Professor Wolak, for your enlightening talk.
Thank you very much. Sorry about the clicker.
That's fine. Thank you. So we move on to the